we'll hop on. So I'll go ahead and hit record, and I will welcome everyone. This is meeting number 4 for the Economically Disadvantaged and Highly Mobile Students Subcommittee. So I hope everyone had a great holiday break. I hope you're ready to dive back in. And at this point, I will kick it over to Dominique from the department to read the statement.
The Tennessee Department of Education is excited to work with you on this opportunity to discuss the state's formula for funding public education. Before we begin, the department would like to remind you of the following. Conversations on this topic are not intended to reflect on the current BEP funding formula. The current BEP funding formula will remain in place until a new funding formula is recommended to and approved by the Tennessee General Assembly. The public is encouraged to submit comments in writing to ensure that all communications are thoroughly documented and can be reviewed and considered in the future. Public comment is encouraged to focus on developing a new funding formula rather than revising the current funding formula. Consider what should be funded in a new funding formula and at what level. Subcommittees will be responsible for reviewing public comment and making recommendations for what should be included in a new funding formula. While all committees, subcommittees, and members of the public should feel free to communicate openly, documents and records may be subject to public inspection pursuant to the Tennessee Public Records Act and may be publicly posted or otherwise made available. All recommendations that are submitted by committees and subcommittees will be reviewed and considered, but not all recommendations will ultimately be included in the proposed new funding formula.
Thank you, Dominique, and we'll go straight into the roll call or the attendance. You're muted, Dominique.
I see Gloria, Alyssa, Victor, Jennifer, Dyrese, and I have somebody on the phone. If they can identify themselves. It's a 731 number.
If you're on the phone, could you identify yourself so that we can take the attendance, please? They might be driving, Dominique, so we can come back to them. All right, we'll move forward. So before we dive into our business for the day, next slide, Dominique, or 2 slides. So wanted to take a couple moments and take a. All right, Dominique, that's Representative Hurt, the 731 number. All right, so we are in meeting 4 of 6. So as you can see, for this meeting, we'll continue to review feedback, but today we really want to focus on categorizing everything into our buckets and prioritizing them. On our most recent call that the subcommittee chairs had with Commissioner Schwinn, Commissioner Schwinn shared with us that between meeting 4, so this meeting, and meeting 5, the next meeting, the department is going to put together a draft funding formula to share. It will not have numbers, but she will use the feedback that we provide from this committee, from this subcommittee, and then other subcommittees to inform what that looks like. So I think we're in good shape, but we will take a dive and really hone in on categorizing today what those must-haves, should-haves, nice-to-haves, long shots should be. So that's what we're doing today. Going to go a little bit out of order here. We do have a guest that I've invited on. I think it'll be a good exercise for us to, warm up to thinking about what and how we should prioritize some of these items. So joining us is Josh McGee. Josh is a research assistant professor, associate director over at the University of Arkansas. He is in the Department of Education Reform. He's also the chief data officer for the state of Arkansas. And Josh has worked extensively with different states on this issue, specifically school funding and how states have shifted to a student-based funding formula. I know that several of you in the recent past, have asked about, what have other states done? How have they approached this? Like, what have been some ways in which they've said, we should move from resource-based to student-based, and why is that? And what are some considerations and steps they've taken to do that? And so Josh is going to spend a few minutes sharing, some of his researching experience with us. And like I said, I think this will be a good warming up exercise as we then turn to how we what we should consider to the commissioner, to the governor, on these final considerations as they make preparations for the draft formula. Josh, I'll kick it over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Victor, and thanks for the invitation. Really appreciate it, and look forward to talking with you all. As Victor said, I am a professor at the University of Arkansas, and I work with the state. I'm chief data officer. I try to help them use data and evidence to inform policy. I think it's really commendable that the state of Tennessee has put together these committees to hopefully inject some both community input, but also data and evidence into this process. As you know, changing education funding formulas is a long-term process. It's challenging. Tennessee's current funding formula was put in place 3 decades ago, and there have been minor changes since then. It's a relatively inflexible type of formula. It's a resource-based formula. Most states have moved away from resource-based formulas in the 3 decades or so since Tennessee put its formula in place. Since the BEP was put in place, just to kind of give you some context of how education funding has changed among the states over time. Overall, per pupil expenditure, so the spending per pupil, the gap with the national average in Tennessee has grown by 20%. So Tennessee has fallen behind on per pupil expenditures since BEP was put in place. Average teacher salaries have fallen behind the national average. The gap has grown by 35%. So there, the gap has grown even more. And the inflation-adjusted average salary for teachers has actually even declined since 2000. So even in the recent past, the BEP has not kept up with the times in terms of providing adequate funding. The pandemic has highlighted a lot of the challenges with the BEP. First, I mentioned that it was inflexible. Education conditions have changed pretty substantially over time. Of course, 30 years ago, education looked a lot different, but the pandemic has accelerated that. For example, education has shifted much more heavily towards blended learning and the use of tech. And we also know that there's a lot of evidence that students with the most need have fallen even further behind, especially those that are the focus of this committee. So those that are economically disadvantaged and/or are highly mobile. Another challenge with the BEP is that districts and schools tend to use the BEP as a spending model and staff according to the BEP. This leads to less variation in schooling models and makes it challenging for schools to be responsive to their particular students' needs. That's very important in light of the fact that students' needs have changed over time, but also the pandemic has widened those gaps. And so focusing on students with more need who are falling further behind right now is imperative. Many of the states that have changed their funding formula over the last 3 decades have moved towards more of a student-centered approach. They've done this for a variety of reasons. First, it's adaptable. It's more flexible. There's more flexibility in how dollars are spent. It doesn't set precedent for how schools are staffed or what programs are put into place. It's easier when you have a student-centered model to be equitable and fair. So allocate resources, more resources to students who need the most help. You can provide additional transparency around how dollars are spent, and you can also simplify formulas and make it more predictable over time. So if we talk about what states have done, so let's just look in the neighborhood of Tennessee. Most states in the U.S. use weighted student funding, including your neighbors, Arkansas, Kentucky, and Missouri. Arkansas and Kentucky have pretty simple weighted student funding models. Fewer than 10 states use a pure resource-based formula like Tennessee. There are a few of those in that are SREB states that are in the southern region. If you look at the states that are in the southern region that use a resource-based formula, see if you want to compare yourself to these states. One is Alabama, the other is West Virginia. States that are relatively slow to move are not necessarily keeping up with the times. States that do weighted student funding well, that have moved towards a weighted student funding formula and do it relatively simply. If you want to look at states and their statutes, you can look at states like Kentucky, your neighbor to the north, North Dakota, Oklahoma, Hawaii. I'm not going to go into too much depth on these particular states, but the components of a weighted student funding formula are you have a base amount that is kind of the minimum amount that will be allocated per pupil to schools. And then that base amount is augmented based on particular categories of student need. Common categories of student need are economically disadvantaged students, English language learners, and special needs students. All of the states that I listed include those categories. Some of them handle it in different ways, and some of them include additional categories. Since I'm in Arkansas, I know a fair amount about the way that Arkansas does it, and I think it actually serves as a great example of how you can combine a resource-based approach with a weighted student funding formula and kind of move towards a student-based approach. So Arkansas had a series of court cases in the 90s and early 2000s that forced us to rethink our funding formula. Arkansas moved towards a student-based approach. However, to set the base amount in that weighted student funding formula, the state still goes through an exercise every 5 years to determine what resources are at a minimum the average school in the state would need to actually operate. And so our state on a 5-year rolling basis looks at how many teachers per pupil, how many librarians, a similar approach to what Tennessee does through its funding formula, but they use that approach to set the base amount of funding for the average school, the minimum amount in the weighted student funding formula. Then that base amount is augmented by weights for particular types of students. Arkansas has, as I mentioned, most states do this, have weights for economically disadvantaged students, English language learners, and special needs students. On economically disadvantaged students, they not only have a weight to increase funding for individual students who are economically disadvantaged who qualify for free and reduced lunch program or other public services, but they also provide additional funding for schools that have concentrated levels of poverty, so that have high percentages of economically disadvantaged students. So that's another approach that is put in place in many states. So I'm happy to go into additional detail on any and all of that, answer any questions about particular states, what states do. I'll just kind of sum up and leave you with some parting thoughts that I'm sure you've heard before. So right now, the Tennessee's education funding formula, the BEP, is inflexible. It requires a lot of work to update on a yearly basis. It doesn't direct more resources to the students who need the most help, and that creates challenges. A weighted student funding formula is becoming the dominant model. Most states in the U.S. use weighted student funding, and many states are trying to simplify their funding formula and direct more resources, state resources, to economically disadvantaged kids, English language learners, and special needs students. And that is a great way to go for the state of Tennessee. If you want to look at examples for how you might do this, your neighboring states, Arkansas, Missouri, and Kentucky, are great places to look. You can look at the categories of need that they have, how they handle those categories of need. There's some variation there. And as I said, Arkansas takes a resource-based approach to build up their foundation or base amount that's included in their weighted student funding. And so that might be something that Tennessee might look at doing that will feel familiar, will help them build towards a base amount, but will move the state towards more of a student-centered approach.
Thank you, Josh. That was great. I'm going to kick it over to members for questions in a second, but I do want to ask a question because this came up on my chair's call with the commissioner. Could you talk about concentration of poverty versus just poverty and kind of what that means? Because I think, we think about poverty, but those two specific terms come up, and there are people definitely on this call that are smarter than me. And so you can break it for me.
Yeah, happy to do it. The thinking is that kids that qualify for state programs like the free and reduced lunch program, or for other types of programs, so SNAP benefits or TANF benefits, so other federal or state programs for low-income families and children, you can imagine that those students will need more help, especially now after the pandemic, that we've seen the gap in performance widen for them, and also seen those families and those kids face more challenges with remote and blended learning. So you can imagine that those kids need more resources. So generally there's a weight to account for the fact that schools may need to do more to help those students thrive and reach their full potential. The reason to do a concentration weight is because we know that there are peer effects, and we know that that multi-generational poverty is a real challenge in a lot of our communities. I know this from visiting the Delta and dealing with those schools. We have not fixed the challenge of multi-generational poverty. So in acknowledgement of that, many states have said, look, if there's a high concentration of economically disadvantaged students, that we may need to give resources on top of the weight for student poverty, because those schools face additional challenges that are not faced by schools that do not have high concentrations. They face those challenges around multi-generational poverty, around systemic factors that they've got to overcome, in addition to the individual student factors. So really those concentration weights, those concentration amounts, are an acknowledgement of those additional challenges that those schools face.
Thank you, Josh. Ms. Sweetluck, go ahead.
Yes, good information, Josh. Question for you, maybe a couple of questions. As we talk about the concentration of poverty in those particular schools, and you said they would be given additional funds, is it stipulated what those funds can be used for? Can they be used to reduce class size? Can they be used for, additional TAs? Can they be used for tutoring? So, can they be used to really make a difference? That's what I'm really wondering.
Well, I think that I really appreciate that question. I think that's one of the big challenges that you face with Tennessee's current education funding model, is that it's inflexible and it points school leaders in a certain direction in the way that they staff and that they serve students. And we know that students have varying needs. We know that the flexibility to meet those needs, meet students where they are, is a huge advantage and can help students thrive both in socio-emotional, their socio-emotional growth and as well as their academic. So a lot of strings attached. And so that's one of the beauties of the way the student formula is you're not dictating to schools how they spend those. You're providing dollars to schools and additional dollars to schools that have students with additional needs, but also to schools that have concentration of students with needs and allowing them to choose how best to meet their students' needs. Now, that should be paired, that flexibility should be paired with transparency and accountability to make sure that those dollars are being spent in a way that actually leads to growth for those students, either socially or academically, and that they're actually achieving the results that we hope for. They're thriving, they're reaching their full potential. But that flexibility, I think, is paramount and something that is severely lacking in the state of Tennessee right now.
Probably have time for one more question if anyone has any.
Yes, I do have another. Oh, okay. Go.
Hello?
Senator Gilmore, was that you?
Yes, I wanted to ask a question.
Yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
The states that he gave, I think he said Arkansas, Kentucky, and Missouri, have this new formula that they have employed. Has it been in existence long enough to see it made a difference in student outcomes in terms of narrowing that gap between students of color and from impoverished communities?
That's a great question, Senator. In all of those states, they've had a weighted student funding or some variation of a weighted student formula for quite some time. As you know, closing gaps either between economically advantaged and disadvantaged students or racial gaps in performance is really, really challenging. I can't say that all of those states have solved those problems. What I can say is that those states provide additional flexibility to schools to meet their student needs. Whenever those states go to talk about education funding, and they have constituents who want to increase funding for particular students, for students who need additional needs. That conversation is much easier than it is in Tennessee, where in Tennessee you have to talk about a 46 element funding formula matrix of things that would affect funding. In these states, they can say, hey, we should increase the weight for economically disadvantaged students, and that will directly impact the resources that are given to the students that have more needs. So I can't tell you that moving to weighted student funding has solved all the problems, but I can tell you that it has provided additional flexibility, made the conversation around student funding and how you direct resources much simpler and easier to have, and hopefully will meet students' needs better.
Is there any documentation at all that shows that the needle moves regarding that increased funding?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have that documentation right now, but I could follow up afterwards with Victor with anything that I could find to show how funding moves once reforms are put into place. One of the challenges, Senator, that happens whenever states go to, I would say that no state does this perfectly. No state has a pure weighted student funding formula. One of the challenges that states face, and you guys are facing it right now, is you have a funding formula in place. And so getting from here to there often creates a little bit of a Frankenstein in the interim. nobody wants to go blank slate, and so often they choose a little of this and a little of that, a dash of this, and end up with something that is half measure. In fact, if you look at southern states, so states that participate in the Southern Region Education Board, most of those states have a hybrid funding model. So they have elements of weighted student funding, but they also have elements of a resource-based formula. So that's one of the challenges that we face, is nobody does this perfectly, but happy to follow up with any information on whether moving towards weighted student funding closes funding gaps for the students that you want, and academic performance.
Yeah, okay. Well, it just makes sense what you're saying. I just think it would probably be an easier sell to my, particularly to some of my conservative colleagues, if we could show that there's a correlation between increasing funding to these targeted groups and improving school performance and closing that gap. Thank you again. Your presentation was fascinating.
Thank you, Josh, for all that. And members, I hope that this was helpful. It's definitely got helpful for me. I've learned a few things as well. I think this is a good segue for us to dive into, what we see as a committee on our own must-haves and how we should prioritize items. So yes, Josh, thank you again for joining us. Let's hop over to the slide around prioritization, Dominique. Okay. So what we want to do at this point is, and we've done a lot of this already, but like I said, we want to really fine tune everything because we want to make sure that we're providing the commissioner with some concise recommendations here. So our must-haves, should-haves. So must-haves are, things that are required, right? Federal, state law, safety, those kinds of things. You can't do that. You can't do one without the other, right? Should-haves, supports and services that may or may not be mandatory, but are essential to ensure that the groups of students, so for us, economically disadvantaged and highly mobile students, ensure that those students are receiving access to quality education. And then nice to have. What does that mean? Supports and services that are not mandatory, not essential, but they, one, may provide a clear and added benefit to students, and two, have a clear return on investment related to student achievement, future success. And then your long shot is shooting for the moon, all, other supports and services and ideas that come to mind. Next slide, Dominique. Next slide. Yes. All right. So we're essentially going to go through, overall different categories: overall, base, weights, direct funding, outcomes, and other. And there's a sheet, a Google sheet, I think, that Dominique shared with everyone that you should have received. And essentially, Dominique has used that Google Doc to kind of keep tally of items that we have that we've mentioned over the course of our meetings together. And it's broken down into the categories that I just mentioned. So base, weights, direct funding, outcomes, other. And we'll do our best to kind of go back and forth for you here. But let's hop back to the slide, please, slide deck.
That document, the Google Doc, I put in the chat. So if you want to go open your chat, each person should be able to individually see it.
Oh, perfect. Thank you, Dominique. So overall, this is some feedback that the department has received, between the town halls, online submissions, and even through other subcommittees. And so some of the main things that have stood out around, districts should not receive less funding than they currently receive in the BEP, right? I think that this definitely has been a resounding request. The other is maintaining flexibility for local district budgeting. We talked about that a little bit in our meeting right before the end of the year, end of 2021, about districts being able to have that flexibility and spend in areas that they see fit. Obviously, we move towards a student-based formula that districts need to ensure that they're spending based on the needs of those students that those dollars are allocated for. Couple others, requests, ensuring whatever is currently funded outside of the BEP is included in a new formula. In the chair's meeting that we had with the commissioner last week, she said that will be the case. And then, of course, the piece that'll vary depending on your school district, right? The local match, the local contribution, how much money local governments, local municipalities can put back in to fund, and that kind of varies across the state. I think this is a good, overall, general feedback. And does anyone think that we should add something to this? Is this list too short? Feel free to hop in. And if not, we'll hop to the next one, which is base.
I've got a question.
Yes.
We talked about earlier the very much needed, as we look at the students that we're focused on, very much need for wraparound services to include, making sure you've got nurses, the mental health, the mental health kind of support, counselors, and those things, tutoring, those things that we know children in this particular category do not normally have. Even things like tutoring and help with homework. We're talking about students that a lot of times don't have anyone at home to even help them with homework. So, and especially if we go back and talk about, as Josh just did, about what has shown up during this pandemic, when we said that you need to be virtual and et cetera, and when they've not had the support. So can we some kind of way make sure that some of those wraparound things are included, are requested? They just need them. If we want them to be successful, I think that has to happen.
Absolutely, and I think when we dive into the base, we're going to get to a lot of what you just mentioned. Next slide, please. So looking at the base, so this is like the base amount of dollars, how much, where we start, right? Where we start, and what's to be included in like just that foundational starting point. So some things that we have discussed, so not looking at the slide deck for a second, looking at the Google Doc, we've mentioned parent liaisons, counselors and like school psychologists, mental health counselors, family resource centers. We've also mentioned, this is a little more abstract, but looking at what the actual need of students are, instead of just focusing on the actual physician. So at this point, we need to go ahead and throw into our categories whether parent liaisons, counselors, roles of family resources, are those our must-haves? Are those our should-haves? Are those our nice-to-haves? Are those long shots? So, parent liaisons, you can just jump in here, throw it in the chat. What are we thinking? And remember, I want everyone to feel good about where we're going with this. So please.
I think for this group of students, that it's almost a must, because some of them clearly cannot communicate well with staffing if they don't have some help from a liaison.
And I thank you, President Sweetlove, for bringing those issues up. I think the mental health component and the tutoring are must-haves, because many of these children come from backgrounds that we can't even imagine that's going on in their home. So I think that mental health component is important, and the tutoring is also important.
And this is Jennifer Nichols. I agree with both of your statements. And of course, I'm always going to be thinking, you know, you just mentioned what's going on in the home is unimaginable. And, you know, I get constant reports about what's going on in the home. And it covers both the economically disadvantaged and highly mobile. And it's amazing that these kids ever catch up. And unfortunately, without tutoring and mental health counseling, you know, the problem just becomes that more difficult.
Great. Thank you all. So looks like we have parent liaisons and the counselors and the school psychologists and the mental health specialists as must-haves. And then the other thing we had was around family resource centers. I'd probably throw that in a nice to have or even a long shot, you know, because there's a coordination component of that with family resource centers. Commissioner Nichols can probably speak more to this than I can, but I'm sure that there's some sort of compliance process as well in the coordination. So that might be a little bit more cumbersome to come by putting into a base. Are there any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think that's one of those things that we would love to have, but it may take some time to build towards that, considering all the components that go into what exists, at least from my recollection when I was teaching, what goes into family resource center. Some people may be able to scale those immediately and have access to resources and have them pretty readily, and others probably have to build towards it. I think that definitely is one of those things that would be nice to have. But I don't know that it goes into the same tier as you know, parent, which I think the parent liaison piece is extremely important. I'm serving on 2 boards on CMOs right now, and everybody's thinking about partnering, not necessarily engaging, but like parent partnership. And then the ideal around the counselors and social emotional supports. I think that's paramount. Like, we need that yesterday.
Thank you. Let's go ahead and hop to weights, the weights section. So we definitely have, I'm proud of like the conversation we've had around the weights. Obviously, the economically disadvantaged students, you know, the students that we've been tasked with, you know, looking at and ensuring that we provide recommendations that meet their needs. So in our chart here, in our doc, we mentioned economically disadvantaged students, students with disabilities, and then our ELL students. So I would throw all 3 of those into the must-have. Are there any thoughts about that? Making those must-haves. And remember, with the weights, these would be on top of the base. So these are supplemental funds that would go towards students in these subgroups that would ensure that they are getting that access to a high-quality education that we have been talking about and that we've collectively said that they deserve, right? Any thoughts there?
I think dyslexia needs to go somewhere, could it go with student with disabilities? Because I think it's critical, because students with dyslexia, if it's not addressed, have a really hard time keeping up.
Absolutely, and if I recall correctly, based off of federal guidelines, dyslexia might be included in there. So we might be covered. The department will have to check me on that and verify that. But we might be covered in there. But maybe in our notes to the commissioner, we could put an asterisk next to dyslexia to make sure that we're looking at students who are in that column as well, specifically.
Victor, for clarification, as we're talking about weights, are we looking at, like, in addition to the base, and are we weighting these areas equitably and equally across, or would these receive different weights even within underneath the broader unique learning needs? So, for instance, students with disabilities and gifted students receive a different weight than English language learners, even though these will all be weighted in some capacity, but different weights based off of the assessment of the strongest need among those unique learning needs, or not clear on that, but anything that you can provide would be helpful.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I think that's probably not something that we can answer in our capacity as a subcommittee. And I think the department, and then of course the legislature, will have to dive into that. So, like, how much outside of what's currently in there? So should there be an increase of X amount of percent, right? Or should there be an increase of X amount of dollars for ELO students? Should there be, X amount increase or X amount of percentage increase for your economically disadvantaged students? Dominique, maybe we put that in our notes as well about ensuring that there's equity in weights, or taking a look at that and what that could look like. That's a great question, Diaries. Thank you for that.
Absolutely. One more push here too, as well. I was on the that initial collaborative when Ed Trust in Tennessee was doing work around their Finance Institute, and they similarly were looking at several different models across the country. And it seems like everybody in real time is kind of navigating towards the realization, like, we need more nurses and social and emotional mental health supports and all of these things. And one of the things I wonder, and we couldn't come to a clear determination, but I think it would warrant us thinking about it moving forward, and not necessarily dealing with specifically the funding element here, but it's more along the evaluation piece of it. Have there are people who are saying, like, we're funding social, emotional, and mental health supports, but they don't have the evaluative tools that connect it to, like, did our money that we provided for these resources increase growth, increase achievement? And I think, obviously the department's probably thinking about that now, but it would behoove us to really, make sure that we, as we're doing this, simultaneously ensuring that, like, will we be able to link this to, like, as our money has been allocated, are we actually seeing the results necessary? Because when we were looking at other models across other states, people were providing money for these things, but there was nothing that was clear that said that the money that we were allocating was actually making a difference, academic or from a growth standpoint either. So just putting that out there, not necessarily dealing specifically with, funding directly, but more so like ensuring on the back end that we have systems in place to make sure we're able to effectively evaluate our allocations, and that they're obviously doing what we're intending them to do.
Yeah, another great point. And when the commissioner presented an update to the governor last month, this came up around, ensuring, what our seeing what the outcomes are. Did we do the right thing in adopting a student-based funding formula? How were those outcomes? How do we measure that? The money that was supposed to be allocated for your economically disadvantaged students. One, was that money allocated? Two, did it improve outcomes for students, right? So, definitely things to keep in mind. Something else, it's actually here in the slide deck, but around the charter enrollment. Are there any thoughts about that? Because as we know, our charter schools do have students who fall into the economically disadvantaged category, as well as the other two subgroups that we've mentioned. So, potentially making that a nice to have, or perhaps even a must have. Since when we look at concentrations of charter schools mostly in our larger cities, but with the Charter Commission now in full steam, possibilities for charter schools to be established outside of our larger cities. So, are there any thoughts there? And probably keep moving.
It might be helpful if people aren't talking to mute yourself, and then when you want this talk off mute, we have a large echo.
Go ahead, Ms. Sweetlove.
Yes, we didn't have an opportunity to ask when Josh was on, but he mentioned the fact that I think in Arkansas somewhere they've got a review process every 5 years. Has the commissioner talked about when this will be reviewed and how it will be reviewed?
I have not had a conversation with her about that, and Dominique can probably speak more to this, but that's a great question because currently there's the BEP review committee. If that committee continues to do the work it's tasked to do, then I'm sure there'll be some sort of review going on. What that cadence will be, I'm not sure, but definitely a great point there.
I will add it in the questions to send in today after our meeting.
Great, thank you. And then something else that we mentioned about a weight for high school students, probably be nice to have as well, because as we mentioned last meeting, it costs a little bit more for those students, right? AP courses, post-secondary preparation, the counselors for college, workforce development, that kind of thing. Next slide, Dominique. All right, looking at additional dollars, direct funding. So, here in the deck, we're talking about CTE, we're talking about innovative school models, so STEM, high dosage tutoring. I know we've mentioned that a few times on today. In the doc, we mentioned about rural or communities with that are more sparse having additional dollars. Do we think that's a should have, nice to have, long shot? Additional dollars for our rural communities. We mentioned those communities having fewer social services. I think Commissioner Nichols mentioned some of this at one of our last calls, and Sherelle over at DHS mentioned that as well, looking at
I think just it should have.
Should have. All right. And of course, being in Haywood County, you would
yes.
want to employ anyone. So yes, absolutely. All right. Next slide, Dominique. And then looking at outcomes, right? So our early post-secondary opportunity, or EPSO completion, AP course completion, work-based learning, reading proficiency, right? Even differentiated pay, compensation for teachers, your administrators, your supplementary staff. In in our doc, we've mentioned incentives to bring in more teachers of color in places that need them, right? And I know, Dyrese, this is what you do. What have kind of you guys talked about, and some of your partners when it comes to this? Should have, nice to have, long shot. I mean, I know that you've worked with the state board to move the needle here.
Yeah, are you specifically asking about the increasing educator diversity?
Yeah.
In addition, yeah, I mean, I think that I would like to see, particularly, that I've seen efforts, obviously, working with the state board and getting the policy passed and adopted it last year. But then really trying to get behind that and putting ourselves in a position where we, look to prioritize a little bit more. I think it's, everybody knows our student population is growing more and more diverse. We have 1 million students, 40% of them identify something other than white. And our educator workforce just has not moved in the last 20 years. In the last 20 years, we've increased 4%. We're at 14.5% as a ethnically, racially diverse educator workforce. And, I think this is an opportunity for us to really be, intentional around like, hey, how could we, if these are some of the outcomes that we're already looking for and folks are looking at, early post-secondary opportunities and AP course completion, like how can we infuse some of these things that we already know that we want as outcomes and drive it towards educator diversity? So folks who are in high schools that are taking early post-secondary opportunities, what does it look like to, take AP for all and infuse it with courses that could help someone have a leg up if they were trained to be a teacher, and or infusing CTE in a way where we take the AP for all model and maybe make it broadly, virtually across the state and say, hey, here are classes that anybody could take to be in a virtual collaborative that could gear them towards being an educator. We have these, we can take examples like Hamilton County, and we can take examples like Clarksville and some of these places that have teaching academies in their districts and scale a virtual model that can still hit early post-secondary opportunities, AP completion, but drive some of our young folk towards the early completion of some of the requirements to become an educator. I think that's the kind of strategy that we may have to consider, because while we need to consider that, then we also have like research that comes out, like Vanderbilt Tara just released, that says Black educators have been scored lower on their evaluations for the last 10 years consistently, regardless if they're teaching the same students, the same subject consistently. And so I think, the time to be innovative is also necessary, while we also at the same time try to, take consideration some of the challenges that exist and make the necessary adjustments there. But I think those are some of the things that we can do while we're talking about funding for kids. And then also, obviously, there's a grow your own model. The state's been very instrumental in trying to infuse that in ways where, giving resources to different areas to be able to work with EPPs and districts to come up with models where they can grow their classified staff and people in community that already have bachelor's degrees. I think that we need to keep that. The only other element here that I would consider, and now I'll stop talking, is that we also got to think about leadership too as well. We had the Diverse Leaders Learners collective that the state funded for folks to get administrative licenses, but of the 14.5%, 70% of the people who hold administrative licenses in the state of Tennessee have never had an administrative position. And so, we've seen enough research that says when we have more diverse leadership, they have the ability to hire more diverse staff. So we need more administrators from racial diverse backgrounds in positions where they can hire. But the only way we can get that is if we take our existing pool of folks who have admin licenses and put them in positions to where they can, get those roles. I think it's going to be extremely hard, when we have research coming out saying, hey, your team evaluations have been consistently lower. And we know that the team evaluation makes up 70% of your level of effectiveness. There's not a person in a district that's going to hire somebody who doesn't show that they're proficient in their evaluations, because you're going to be evaluating people as an administrator. So I think all these things are interconnected, but we got to take them in consideration to come up with some strategic initiatives to drive us forward to close this parity gap. Okay, I'll stop talking.
Thank you for that. And so I would say that should be a should have. But but depending on if there's some codification of laws around, if there's some codification of laws around teacher diversity, then obviously that turns from a should have into a must have. So let's mark that one as a should have. And we got about 1 minute left, and I want to be mindful of everyone's time. So I will move quickly through this last one.
Victor, just add something quickly.
Yes, ma'am.
If we could be intentional about Black male teachers and somehow integrate some incentives to attract more Black males as educators.
Yes, ma'am. Dominique, could you put that in the notes? All right, and then on then some other things that we mentioned, obviously mobile considerations for our highly mobile students, definitely a should have. And I think we can leave it at there, leave it at that. Next slide, please, Dominique. Our next meeting will be January 19th, so not next week, but the week after, right after MLK Day. So if there's nothing else left for the good of the order.
Can I, I'm sorry, Victor, before we close, can I read back the recommendations just to make sure that I've captured everything that the group wanted captured?
Absolutely.
Okay, great, thank you. So for the base, I have parent liaisons as a must-have, and I put in parentheses here for, this is especially important for ED and highly mobile students. Family resource centers as a nice-to-have. Mental health supports, must-have. Tutoring, must-have. Was that everything in the base that we wanted to add?
Yes.
Okay, for weights, I have economically disadvantaged, must have, students with disabilities and ELL must have. With students with disabilities, I've added including dyslexia in parentheses. High dosage tutoring, high school student weight as a nice to have. And then Victor, you were saying something, I think, about charter enrollment, and I was having difficulty hearing at that moment. Is there something I missed there? And it might not have even been charter. That was just what I thought that you had said.
Yeah, it was charter, since they serve so many of the marginalized students that we've been discussing as a nice to have.
Okay. Okay, and then direct funding, I have again the high dosage tutoring as a must have and rural and sparsity as a should have. Is that everything there?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and outcomes, I want to make sure I capture everything here. So I have the recommendation would be incentives to increase educator diversity, including leaders. As a should have, do I need to include information about the strategic initiatives that Dyrese was talking about, or would that come into play, you think, somewhere later as if this is something we add to?
Yeah, that'll probably come in later because that would be a result of us, essentially solidifying, the prioritization of the teacher diversity in this new formula.
So then I have incentives to attract more Black male educators, highly mobile as a should have. I didn't have anything with the incentives to attract more Black male educators as far as a prioritization, but I kind of feel like it would also fall in with the one that I read before.
It would, it should have,
okay.
Absolutely.
All right. And then other, the consideration for evaluation of the additional mental health services and additional nurses to see if we're actually seeing the results for what the money is being allocated for. And then the 2 questions that I have to send in is, will there be equity in weights? And will there be a review committee and process for the funding formula if it goes forward? And what will the cadence of that review be?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Just want to make sure I hadn't missed anything.
Yeah, thank you. All right, everyone. Thank you again for your hard work here, and we'll talk to you on the 19th. Have a great day.